Welcome back to the last report, where official records end and the real nightmare begins. Tonight, we open restricted files from the Massachusetts State Police. Unexplained disappearances along the Mohawk Trail, reality distortions in the Berkshire Mountains, and ancient warnings carved into stone that modern authorities chose to ignore. What began as routine highway patrol became something no trooper was prepared for, forcing one officer to choose between duty and sanity itself. So lower the lights, lock your doors, and listen carefully. This is the Massachusetts case. My name is Trooper Daniel Whitmore, badge number 2847, Massachusetts State Police. I've been patrolling the highways and back roads of western Massachusetts for 17 years. Before that, I spent 4 years in the Army, deployed twice to Iraq, saw combat, saw death, and thought I understood what fear looked like. I was wrong about everything. Before I tell you what happened last November and what finally broke my silence, after 8 months of trying to forget, I want you to understand one thing very clearly. If you're watching this while planning a scenic drive through the Berkshires, if you're a leaf peeper looking for that perfect New England autumn experience, you need to hear this. What I'm about to say could save your life, your sanity, or something far more important that you don't even know you possess yet. Drop a comment. Are you from Massachusetts? Have you ever driven Route 2 through the Mohawk Trail at night and felt like the road itself was watching you? Have you ever noticed the mile markers counting wrong or seen exit signs that vanish when you look directly at them? There is a 23-mile stretch of the Mohawk Trail between Charlemont and North Adams that does not behave according to the laws of physics as we understand them. Specifically, the section between mile marker 37 and mile marker 14, where the road winds through the deepest part of the Berkshire Mountains, following paths that Native Americans used for thousands of years before the first European ever set foot in Massachusetts. Everyone driving through western Massachusetts has the right to know what's really happening in those mountains, in that specific corridor where 3 different tribal territories once met, and where boundaries were established long before any modern government existed. What I am about to tell you goes against every oath I swore when I put on this uniform. I swore to protect and serve. I swore to uphold the law. But most importantly, I swore to tell the truth. And the truth is that there are standing orders within the Massachusetts State Police, unofficial but universally understood, that contradict everything we're supposed to represent. There are protocols passed down from senior troopers to rookies, never written in any manual, never discussed in official briefings, but absolutely enforced. And the most important protocol regarding the Mohawk Trail is this. Between sunset and sunrise, during the months of October through February, if you receive a call from that 23-mile stretch, you wait. You wait exactly 72 hours before responding. You document the call time, you note the location, and then you do nothing for 3 full days. I broke that protocol on November 3rd, 2024. After what happened, after learning that we've lost 11 people in that corridor since I broke the rules, I can no longer remain silent. This is the story that the Massachusetts State Police would prefer stayed buried in sealed files marked Administrative Review Pending. This is the story of why those unwritten rules exist and what happens when someone like me decides that protecting civilians means responding immediately to calls for help. I need to explain something about the Mohawk Trail first, something they don't teach you in the State Police Academy, but that every trooper who's patrolled western Massachusetts for more than a few years, learns eventually. The road we call Route 2 follows an ancient Native American path that connected the Mohawk and Pocumtuck peoples. The trail was used for trade, for warfare, for spiritual pilgrimages to sacred sites hidden in those mountains. When European settlers arrived and eventually built a modern road along that route, they did what colonizers always do. They paved over the past without understanding what they were covering up, without respecting the boundaries that had existed for millennia, without honoring the agreements that kept something ancient and powerful in balance. There are stones along that route if you know where to look. Gray granite markers, worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain, carved with symbols that no modern archaeologist can definitively translate. The official story is that they're property markers or trailblazes left by early colonists. That's a lie. Those stones are warnings. They mark boundaries. And the symbols, which look almost like stick figures or abstract designs to the untrained eye, tell a very specific story in the language of the Mohawk people. They tell the story of the trail walker. I learned about the trail walker from a man named Joseph Kanote. Joseph was Mohawk, a member of the Mohawk Nation in Akwesasne, and he worked as a cultural consultant for the state park system. I met him 3 years before the November incident back in 2021, after I responded to what seemed like a simple missing person case. A hiker had vanished on one of the trails near the hairpin turn, a notorious spot on the Mohawk Trail, where the road makes an almost 180-degree curve around the mountain. The hiker's car was found in the parking area. His backpack was found on the trail, but he was never found, and the search and rescue teams reported something odd. They said their compasses didn't work properly in that area. They said their GPS devices showed their location shifting randomly. And they said that some of the search dogs refused to continue past certain points on the trail, sitting down and whining as if they sensed danger. Joseph was brought in to help search because he knew the area from his childhood, had hiked those mountains with his grandfather before the old man passed. I was assigned to assist him, to provide law enforcement presence during the search. We spent 3 days combing through those woods, and on the third day, as we were about to give up, Joseph stopped at one of those carved stones. He stood there for a long time, just staring at it, his hand resting on the granite surface. Then he looked at me with an expression I'll never forget, a mixture of sadness and fear, and something that looked almost like resignation. "You won't find him," Joseph said. "He crossed the boundary." I didn't understand what he meant. I asked him to explain. At first, he was reluctant, saying that some knowledge was dangerous, that there were reasons his people had stopped speaking openly about certain things after the colonizers came. But eventually, he told me about the trail walker. He said it was a spirit, an entity, a force that existed long before humans walked these mountains. The trail walker was tied to the ancient paths, the routes that connected sacred sites and places of power. When the Mohawk and other tribes used these trails, they understood the rules. They knew when to travel and when to avoid certain areas. They knew what offerings to leave at the boundary stones. They knew the songs that kept them safe and the prayers that maintained the balance between their world and the world the trail walker inhabited. According to Joseph, the trail walker wasn't malevolent in the way we understand evil. It was more like a natural force, like gravity or magnetism. Neither good nor bad, but absolutely dangerous if you didn't respect its power. The carved stones mark the edges of its territory, the places where the boundary between our reality and something else grew thin. During certain times of year, particularly during the autumn and winter months, when the veil between worlds was traditionally considered weakest in many indigenous belief systems, the trail walker would become more active. People who crossed those boundaries without proper knowledge or protection wouldn't necessarily die. They would simply stop existing in our version of reality. They would step into the trail walker's domain, into a space that overlapped with our world, but operated according to different rules. I'm a rational man. I went to college. I served in the military. I've been trained in criminal investigation, evidence collection, and logical thinking. But after spending 3 days searching those woods, after seeing how the technology failed in specific locations, after watching experienced search dogs refuse to proceed past certain points, I couldn't completely dismiss what Joseph told me. More importantly, after I researched the history of disappearances along the Mohawk Trail, I found a pattern that supported his story. Since 1920, when the Mohawk Trail was first established as a major automobile route, there have been 147 documented disappearances along that 23-mile stretch. That's an average of roughly 1.4 people per year, which might not sound significant until you realize that the rest of Route 2, which spans over 140 miles across Massachusetts, has averaged only 0.3 disappearances per year during the same period. The Mohawk Trail section has nearly 5 times the disappearance rate of comparable rural highway sections. And the disappearances follow a pattern. They cluster during autumn and winter. They occur primarily at night. And in 83% of the documented cases, the missing person's vehicle was found with the keys in the ignition, the headlights on, and the driver's door open, as if they had simply stepped out intending to return momentarily. The official explanation is that people get disoriented in the dark, wander off the road, and succumb to exposure or fall from one of the many steep cliffs that line the route. But that explanation doesn't account for why the bodies are so rarely found, doesn't account for why search dogs lose the scent at specific points, doesn't account for the strange electronic malfunctions that search teams consistently report. And it definitely doesn't account for what I experienced on November 3rd, 2024. It was a Sunday night, the first Sunday in November. The weather was cold but clear, temperatures in the high 30s. No snow yet, but frost warnings in effect for the higher elevations. I was working the evening shift, 4 p.m. to midnight, patrolling the Western District, which included the Mohawk Trail. It was supposed to be a quiet shift. Sunday nights usually were, especially after tourist season ended. Most people heading through the Berkshires did so during daylight hours, and the few locals who lived along the route knew better than to drive it after dark during the autumn months. At 9:47 p.m., dispatch contacted me with a 911 call. Female, caller, distressed, reporting that her vehicle had broken down on Route 2, near mile marker 28. She said she was alone, that her cell phone was dying, and that she was scared. The dispatcher asked her what she was scared of specifically, and there was a long pause before she said, "I don't know. I just feel like something's wrong, like I shouldn't be here." The call cut off before dispatch could get any additional information. I was about 15 minutes away from mile marker 28, which put the caller right in the middle of that 23-mile corridor. My first instinct was to respond immediately. But then I remembered the protocol. I remembered the warning that Sergeant Morrison had given me during my first month patrolling the Western District. If you get a call from the trail at night during the cold months, he'd said, you call it in, you document it, and you wait 72 hours. No exceptions. When I'd asked why, he'd just looked at me with the same expression I'd seen on Joseph Canote's face. Because those are the rules, Whitmore, and the rules exist for a reason. But this was a woman alone on a cold night with a dead vehicle. This was exactly the kind of situation troopers are supposed to handle immediately. So I made a decision. I radioed dispatch, confirmed the location, and told them I was responding. There was a long pause before the dispatcher, a veteran named Carol Santos, who'd been with the state police for 25 years, came back on the radio. Trooper Whitmore, be advised that Sergeant Morrison recommends waiting for daylight response per standard protocol for that location. Copy that, I said, but I'm responding now. There's a civilian in potential danger. Another long pause. Then Carol's voice came back, quieter, almost reluctant. 10-4, Trooper Whitmore. Please maintain radio contact. Check in every 10 minutes. I should have recognized the tone in her voice. I should have understood that she was trying to warn me without breaking whatever code of silence existed around the Mohawk Trail protocols. But I was focused on my duty, on the oath I'd sworn to protect and serve. So I accelerated toward mile marker 28, watching the road wind through the dark mountains, the headlights of my cruiser cutting through the night like a knife through black water. The Mohawk Trail at night is beautiful in a stark, almost alien way. The road follows the contours of the mountains, rising and falling, curving sharply around peaks and plunging into valleys. During the day, you can see the forest stretching for miles, the leaves brilliant with autumn colors. But at night, all you see is what your headlights reveal. The white line marking the road's edge, the yellow line dividing the lanes, the occasional reflective road sign, and beyond that, absolute darkness. The forest presses in on both sides, so dense and deep that it feels less like you're driving through nature and more like you're traveling through a tunnel carved into solid shadow. I passed mile marker 35, then 34, then 33. My radio crackled with static, which was normal for that area. The mountains interfered with signal transmission, creating dead zones and areas where communication became difficult. I checked in with dispatch at the 10-minute mark, confirming my position and status. Carol acknowledged but said nothing else, her voice tight with something that sounded like worry. At mile marker 30, I noticed something odd. There was a car pulled off on the shoulder, a dark sedan that looked abandoned. I slowed down, ready to investigate, but as my spotlight swept over the vehicle, I realized it was rusted and obviously had been sitting there for a long time. Weeds grew up around the tires. The windows were clouded with moisture and dirt. This wasn't a recent breakdown. This was a vehicle that had been abandoned years ago, maybe decades. Why hadn't it been towed? Why was it still sitting there? I continued on, and as I approached mile marker 28, I saw headlights ahead. A car was pulled over on the right shoulder, hazard lights blinking. I felt relief. The caller was still there, still waiting. I pulled up behind the vehicle, activated my own emergency lights, and radioed my position to dispatch. Dispatch, Trooper Whitmore, I'm on scene at mile marker 28, Route 2. One vehicle. Hazards activated. approaching to make contact. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the cruiser. The cold hit me immediately, much colder than it should have been. The temperature gauge in my vehicle had read 38 degrees, but this felt like it was in the 20s, cold enough that my breath came out in thick plumes of vapor. I could see frost forming on the ground, crystallizing in the beam of my flashlight. The vehicle was a Honda Civic, maybe 10 years old, dark blue. Massachusetts plates. The driver's door was open. I approached carefully, following standard procedure, keeping my hand near my service weapon, not because I expected danger, but because training dictates caution in every situation. "State Police," I called out. "Ma'am, are you here?" No response. I reached the open door and shined my flashlight inside. The interior was empty. Keys in the ignition, headlights on, cell phone sitting in the cup holder, purse on the passenger seat. Everything you'd expect to see if someone had just stepped out momentarily. But no driver. I looked around, sweeping my flashlight across the surrounding area. The forest pressed close to the road here, the trees dark and thick. "Ma'am," I called again, louder this time. "This is the state police. If you can hear me, please respond." Nothing. Just the sound of wind moving through the trees, carrying that bone-deep cold that made my skin prickle beneath my uniform. I checked the vehicle registration through my radio, running the plates. The car belonged to a Rebecca Morrison, 28 years old, address in Worcester. I requested dispatch to attempt contact with that number, then began a more thorough search of the immediate area. That's when I noticed the tracks, footprints in the frost that covered the shoulder, heading away from the vehicle. Not running, just walking. The prints led toward the tree line, toward a gap in the forest where an old trail or logging road once existed. I followed them, keeping my flashlight trained on the ground, documenting the path with my body camera. The footprints were small, probably a woman's size 7 or 8. They were clear at first, each step distinct in the frost. But as I followed them into the tree line, they became strange. The prints began to overlap, as if the person had been walking in circles or backtracking over their own path. Then they became erratic, the spacing between steps varying wildly, sometimes just a few inches apart, sometimes several feet. And then, about 30 yards into the forest, they simply stopped. Not at a creek or rock formation where tracks might naturally disappear. Not at a point where the person could have jumped to a different surface. They just ended in the middle of a patch of frost-covered ground, the last print showing the toe of a shoe pressed into the rime, and beyond that, nothing. As if Rebecca Morrison had taken one more step and vanished into thin air. I stood there, feeling the cold seep through my uniform, and for the first time in my career, as a state trooper, I experienced genuine supernatural dread. This wasn't fear of human violence or dangerous driving conditions. This was something deeper, more primal, the kind of fear that lives in the oldest parts of the human brain, the parts that evolved when we were still prey animals afraid of the dark. I radioed dispatch, reporting what I'd found. Carol's response was immediate and sharp. "Trooper Whitmore, return to your vehicle immediately. Do not proceed further into the forest. Sergeant Morrison is en route to your location. Estimated arrival 45 minutes. I should have followed that order, but I could still hear Rebecca Morrison's voice from the 911 call, scared and alone. I couldn't just abandon her if there was any chance she was out there, injured or lost. So I continued forward, following the direction the footprints had been heading before they disappeared. The forest was dense, old growth mixed with younger trees, the underbrush thick with mountain laurel and other vegetation. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, creating sharp contrasts between light and shadow. I could hear sounds now, not just wind, but other things. Branches cracking, movement in the underbrush, what might have been footsteps or might have been my imagination. I called out repeatedly as I walked, "Rebecca Morrison, State Police. If you can hear me, please make noise. I'm here to help." But there was no response, just the forest sounds and that pervasive cold that seemed to grow stronger the further I went from the road. Then I saw it. The boundary stone. One of those carved granite markers Joseph Canote had shown me 3 years earlier. It was about 4 feet tall, covered in moss on one side, the carved symbols still visible on the surface facing the direction I'd come from. The symbols looked like a figure with lines radiating from its body, standing at the intersection of two paths. In the beam of my flashlight, the carving seemed to move, the lines appearing to pulse or shimmer, though I knew that had to be a trick of the light and shadow. I remembered what Joseph had said about these stones. They marked boundaries, places where you needed permission or protection to proceed, and I had neither. But I also had a missing woman somewhere in these woods, and my duty as a law enforcement officer overrode any superstitious concerns about carved rocks. I stepped past the boundary stone, crossing from one side to the other, and the moment I did, everything changed. The temperature dropped instantly, from uncomfortably cold to brutally frigid. My breath crystallized in the air so densely that I could barely see through it. My flashlight flickered, the beam weakening as if the battery was dying, even though I'd just installed fresh ones before my shift. And the sounds of the forest stopped completely. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant traffic noise from the road, just absolute crushing silence. I turned back toward the boundary stone, intending to retreat to the road and wait for Sergeant Morrison. But the stone wasn't behind me anymore. Instead, I saw trees, the same dense forest extending in all directions. The moonlight that had been visible through the canopy moments before was gone. The sky above was completely dark. No stars, no moon, no ambient light from distant towns. Just blackness. My radio crackled with static, then went dead. I tried to key the microphone, to call for assistance, but there was nothing. Not even the carrier wave tone that indicated an open channel. The radio was completely silent, as if it had been switched off, though the indicator lights showed it was still powered on. I was alone in the dark forest, separated from the road by some distance I couldn't accurately judge, and every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to run. But run where? I had no idea which direction led back to the road. The compass on my tactical vest was spinning slowly, the needle rotating without settling on any particular direction. My GPS-enabled radio was non-functional, and my cell phone, when I checked it, showed no signal and a battery indicator that read 4% despite being fully charged an hour earlier. That's when I heard the footsteps. Not animal sounds, not the random cracking of branches, but deliberate, rhythmic footsteps. Human footsteps. Coming from multiple directions at once, as if several people were walking through the forest around me, maintaining the same pace, circling. "Rebecca Morrison?" I called out, though I already knew it wasn't her. The footsteps were too heavy, too measured. This is the state. Police, identify yourself. The footsteps continued, neither approaching nor receding, just maintaining that constant distance and rhythm. And then I saw the first figure. It appeared between two trees about 30 feet away, visible only because it was somehow darker than the surrounding darkness. A human-shaped void that moved with the same measured pace as the footsteps. It had no features, no details, just a silhouette that suggested a person walking, but distorted somehow. The proportions not quite right. The legs were too long. The arms hung too low. And the head, if it could be called a head, seemed to tilt at angles that human necks couldn't achieve. I drew my service weapon, training overriding fear. Stop. Identify yourself. State police. My voice sounded wrong in that silence, muffled and flat, as if the air itself was absorbing the sound. The figure stopped walking but didn't respond. It just stood there, that void in the darkness. And as I watched, another figure appeared, to my left, then another to my right, then more behind me. I was surrounded by these silhouettes, these impossible figures that looked like people, but moved like something else entirely. My body camera was still recording. I knew that much, because I could see the red indicator light. Whatever happened to me, if I didn't make it back, at least there would be evidence. That thought gave me some small comfort as I stood there, weapon drawn, surrounded by entities that shouldn't exist. One of the figures began to move toward me, its footsteps silent now, despite having been clearly audible moments before. I could see it more clearly as it approached, and what I saw made my training, my logic, my entire understanding of reality crack like thin ice under weight. The figure was translucent in some way, like looking at something through layers of gauze or smoke. I could see the trees behind it through its body. And as it moved closer, I could see that it wasn't just one figure, but multiple images superimposed, as if I was seeing the same person in several different positions simultaneously, walking along several different paths at once. I'm Trooper Daniel Whitmore, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. I'm looking for a missing woman. Rebecca Morrison. Have you seen her? The figure stopped about 10 feet away, and then, for the first time, it spoke. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, not through the air, but directly into my head, bypassing my ears entirely. You crossed the boundary, it said. Not angry, not threatening, just stating a fact. You followed the path without permission. I'm trying to help someone, I said. A woman called for help. I'm a law enforcement officer. It's my duty to respond. Duty, the figure repeated. And there was something in that word, some weight or emphasis that suggested the concept was familiar, but perhaps defined differently than I understood it. You serve the law of your people. We serve the law of the path. Both are binding. Both demand sacrifice. What happened to Rebecca Morrison? I asked, trying to focus on my mission despite the unreality of the situation. Where is she? She walked the path, the figure said. She followed the call. Now she serves, as all who cross must serve. Serves what? Serves who? I was gripping my flashlight so hard my hand ached, the beam still flickering weakly, illuminating nothing useful. The figure didn't answer directly. Instead, it gestured with one translucent arm toward something behind me. I turned, and in the darkness, I saw more figures. But these were different from the voids that surrounded me. These were people. Real people. Or at least, they had been once. I recognized the first one immediately because I'd seen his photograph during the 2021 search. The hiker who'd vanished near the hairpin turn. He was wearing the same clothes he'd worn in his last known photo, but something was wrong with him. He moved, like the void figures, with that same measured pace, and his eyes, when the weak beam of my flashlight crossed his face, reflected no light at all. They were completely black, like holes in his head. Behind him were others. A young woman in a sundress that looked decades out of fashion. An elderly man in what might have been hiking gear from the 1970s. A teenager in a leather jacket. A woman with two small children holding her hands. All of them moving with that same measured pace, walking in circles around a central point I couldn't clearly see. Their faces blank, their eyes black voids. They serve, the figure next to me said. They walk the path. They maintain the boundary. This is the law that was old when your ancestors first crossed the ocean. This is the agreement your kind broke when you built your road without asking, when you ignored the stones that marked the sacred places. I was seeing people who had vanished over decades, maybe centuries, transformed into something that wasn't quite human anymore, trapped in some kind of eternal patrol or guard duty. And according to this entity, Rebecca Morrison had joined them, was walking among them, was lost to our world forever. How do I get back? I asked, because I was beginning to understand that I might not make it out of here, that I might become one of these silent figures, walking their eternal path. How do I return to the road? You ask for permission now? The figure said. After you crossed without asking, after you broke the boundary, your kind always does this. Takes first, asks later, expects forgiveness. I didn't know, I said. I was trying to help someone. I didn't mean to break any law or disrespect any boundary. Ignorance is not innocence, the figure replied, but perhaps it is excuse enough. Once, the figure raised its translucent arm and pointed in a direction that my broken compass couldn't identify. Walk that way. Do not turn from the path. Do not look back. Do not stop until you see your lights. And understand, Trooper Daniel Whitmore, that you have been given a gift. You have crossed the boundary and returned. That means you now serve as we do, not walking the path eternal, but guarding the threshold between your world and ours. You will keep others from crossing. You will enforce the boundary. This is the price of your return. What if I refuse? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Then you walk with the others, the figure said simply. You join the path. You serve in the old way. There is no third choice. There is only service in your world or service in ours. I looked at the figures walking their circles, at what had become of Rebecca Morrison and all the others who'd crossed the boundary without knowledge or protection. I thought about my family, my life, my duties as a trooper. And I made my choice. I accept, I said. I'll guard the boundary. I'll keep others from crossing. Just let me return. The figure nodded, a gesture that seemed almost human. Then go. And remember that the boundary is not just here. It is anywhere the old paths cross the new. It is wherever your kind ignores the warnings carved in stone. You will feel it when someone approaches. You will know when the boundary grows thin, and you will turn them back, or you will watch them join the path. I walked in the direction the figure had pointed, keeping my weak flashlight trained on the ground ahead, not looking back as instructed. The trees seemed to press closer, and the darkness was absolute, but I kept moving, counting my steps. fighting the cold that had penetrated deep into my bones. After what felt like hours, but according to my watch was only 12 minutes, I saw lights ahead. The red and blue of police emergency lights, the white of flashlight beams. I heard voices calling my name, and I stumbled out of the forest onto the shoulder of Route 2, where Sergeant Morrison stood next to my cruiser, a search team assembled behind him. "Whitmore!" He rushed toward me, and other troopers caught me as my legs gave out, the cold and exhaustion suddenly overwhelming. "Where the hell have you been? We've been searching for you for 3 hours." 3 hours? I looked at my watch. It was 1:47 a.m., but according to my timeline, I'd only been in the forest for maybe 30 minutes total. Time had moved differently there, wherever there was. They got me into an ambulance, checked my vitals, tried to warm me up. My core temperature was 94 degrees, borderline hypothermic. My fingers and toes were frostbitten. My body camera was running, but the footage was corrupted, showing nothing but static and occasional fragments of darkness. And when they asked me what happened, what I'd seen, I couldn't tell them the truth, because the truth sounded insane. So I lied. I said I'd followed tracks into the forest, gotten disoriented, and wandered lost until I found my way back. I said the technology failures were due to the cold, or maybe electromagnetic interference from the mountain geology. I said I'd seen nothing unusual except dark woods and my own fear. Sergeant Morrison listened to my statement, his face expressionless, and then he pulled me aside once the paramedics cleared me. "You crossed the boundary," he said quietly. "Not a question, a statement of fact." "I don't know what you mean," I replied, but we both knew I was lying. "Yeah, you do," Morrison said. "You went past the stones, you walked the path, and you came back, which means you made a deal, which means you're one of us now, one of the guardians, whether you wanted to be or not." He pulled out a worn leather notebook from his jacket and handed it to me. This belonged to the trooper who taught me about the boundaries, and the one before him learned from someone else. Goes back decades, maybe longer. We're not the first law enforcement officers to learn about the path, Whitmore. We're just the latest in a long line of people who chose to protect others from making the same mistake we did. I opened the notebook. Page after page of handwritten entries dating back to 1967. Entries describing the same phenomena I'd experienced. Entries documenting disappearances, strange encounters, and the unwritten rules that govern patrol of the Mohawk Trail. Entries about the boundary stones, the void figures, and the people who walked the eternal path. The last entry was dated September 2018, written in Morrison's handwriting. It read, "Mile marker 23, 2:15 a.m. Stop vehicle from entering sector. Family of 4, lost tourists." They argued, but complied. Sometimes saving a life means being the bad guy. Sometimes protection looks like obstruction. This is the burden we carry. "Rebecca Morrison," I said. "The missing woman. What happened to her?" Morrison's expression was grim. "She's gone, Whitmore. Same as the others. Crossed the boundary before we could stop her. Happens sometimes despite our best efforts. All we can do is make sure it happens as rarely as possible." "But she's out there," I said, "walking that path. Can't we save her? Can't we bring her back?" "There is no bringing them back," Morrison said flatly. "That's the hardest lesson. Once they cross, once they accept service on the path, they're not fully human anymore. They're not suffering. They're not in pain. They've just become part of something we don't fully understand, something that existed before us and will exist after us. The kindest thing we can do is honor their service by making sure others don't follow. The days immediately following my crossing were difficult in ways I couldn't have anticipated. The frostbite on my fingers and toes healed slowly, but there were other changes that didn't heal at all. My sense of direction became unreliable in certain locations, as if my internal compass had been recalibrated to detect something other than magnetic north. I started experiencing what I can only describe as boundary awareness, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, combined with a metallic taste in my mouth whenever I approached certain locations along the Mohawk Trail or other areas where the boundary grew thin. Sergeant Morrison noticed the changes immediately. He pulled me aside during my first shift back after medical leave and handed me a small leather pouch on a cord. "Wear this," he said. "Don't ask what's in it. Just know it was given to me by a Mohawk elder after my own crossing 15 years ago. It won't protect you from everything, but it'll help you sense when the boundary is active. You'll feel it grow cold against your chest." I opened the pouch, despite his instruction not to. Inside was a mixture of herbs I couldn't identify, a small piece of carved bone, and what looked like a fragment of stone with markings similar to those I'd seen on the boundary stones. When I held it, the sensation of wrongness I'd been feeling since my crossing diminished slightly, like a headache fading from unbearable to merely present. "There are others," Morrison told me during that conversation. "Other guardians. Not just state police, but park rangers, local sheriffs, even some civilians who learned about the boundary through personal experience. We're not organized exactly. No formal meetings, no official communications. But we know each other. We share information through the notebooks, and we coordinate informally to make sure the boundary zones are always watched." He gave me a list of names and contact information. Rangers in Vermont, sheriff's deputies in New Hampshire, a retired conservation officer in Maine. All people who'd crossed boundaries in various locations and returned with knowledge and duty. All people who'd accepted the burden of guarding thresholds that most of society didn't know existed. I started reaching out to them, carefully, using phrases and references that Morrison had taught me. The conversations were guarded at first. These were people who'd learned to be suspicious of anyone asking questions about phenomena that couldn't be officially acknowledged. But once I shared my own experience, once I described my crossing and return, they opened up. There was a pattern to all of our stories. Each of us had been in law enforcement or emergency services. Each of us had responded to a call or situation that led us across a boundary without proper preparation. Each of us had encountered the entities that guarded those boundaries, the void figures, or whatever name they were called in different regional traditions. And each of us had been given the same choice: join the eternal path, or return as guardians. But I also learned that the boundaries weren't identical. The Mohawk Trail boundary had its specific characteristics, its connection to Native American sacred sites and ancient agreements. But the boundary in Vermont's Green Mountains, according to Ranger Sarah Childress, was connected to early colonial violence, to massacres and broken treaties that had left spiritual wounds in the land. The boundary along coastal Maine, according to Deputy Marcus Chen, was tied to shipwrecks and drowned sailors, to maritime traditions of sacrifice and sea graves. What connected all these boundaries was violation. Human actions that had broken natural or spiritual law. Places where the normal rules of reality had been damaged by violence, disrespect, or ignorance. And in each case, the boundaries had to be guarded, protected from further violation, maintained by those of us who'd learned about them through painful experience. Over the next few months, I learned what it meant to be a guardian of the boundary. I learned to feel when someone was approaching the threshold, a sensation like static electricity on my skin combined with a deep unease in my gut. I learned to recognize the signs of the path's influence, the compass malfunctions, the GPS errors, the electronic failures that indicated reality was growing thin. And I learned how to turn people back without explaining why. I also learned to recognize people who were vulnerable to the boundary's call. It wasn't random. The path didn't draw everyone equally. There were specific types of people who were more susceptible. Those in psychological crisis. Those running from trauma or loss. Those seeking escape or transformation. It was as if the boundary could sense desperation or openness, could identify people whose grip on ordinary reality was already tenuous. This made my job harder in some ways. These were the people who most needed help, who were already suffering, and I had to turn them away from the only route that might have offered them relief, even if that relief came at the cost of their humanity. I had to play the authoritarian, the inflexible cop, the bureaucrat more concerned with rules than compassion. And I had to live with the knowledge that my obstruction, however necessary, probably looked like cruelty to those I was protecting. 3 months after my crossing, I had my second direct encounter with the boundary's guardians. It was late February, a night when the temperature had dropped below zero and the forest was locked in deep winter silence. I was patrolling near mile marker 22, right at the heart of the boundary zone, when I felt that familiar prickling sensation. The leather pouch Morrison had given me grew ice cold against my chest. I pulled over and got out of my cruiser. The night was clear, stars brilliant in the sky, the kind of cold that makes your breath freeze on your eyelashes. And standing at the tree line, barely visible in the starlight, was one of the void figures I'd seen during my crossing. It didn't approach, didn't threaten, just stood there, a darkness darker than the surrounding night, watching the road, watching me. I stood by my cruiser, hand resting on my service weapon, more out of habit than any belief it would be useful, and we observed each other across the distance. After several minutes, the figure spoke, that same voice-in-the-head sensation I'd experienced before. "Guardian," it said, "you keep the watch well." "I'm trying," I replied, not sure if I was speaking aloud or just thinking loudly. "It's not easy. People don't understand why I stop them." "They do not need to understand," the figure said. "They need only to be turned back. Understanding is burden. Protection is mercy." "Rebecca Morrison," I said, bringing up the name that still haunted me. "The woman who crossed the night I broke the rules. Is she aware? Does she suffer?" "Awareness is different here," the figure replied. "She walks. She serves. She exists in time that is not your time. Suffering requires attachment to what was lost. She has released that attachment. She is not unhappy." It wasn't exactly comforting, but it was something. Rebecca Morrison wasn't in pain. She wasn't trapped in some torture. She had simply become something other than human, something that existed according to different rules, in a different layer of reality. "How many?" I asked. "How many walkers are there? How many people have crossed the boundary over all the years?" "Numbers are illusion," the figure said. "The path is eternal. Walkers join and walkers fade. The pattern continues. The boundary is maintained. This is enough. And the carved stones? I pressed. The warnings your people left. Why didn't they stop us? Why didn't they prevent roads from being built through sacred territory? The stones speak clearly to those who remember the language, the figure replied. Your ancestors chose not to remember, chose not to learn, chose to impose their order without understanding what order already existed. The stones remain, the warnings remain. The boundary adapts, but does not forgive. This is the nature of law. The figure faded then, not walking away, but simply dissolving into the darkness like smoke dissipating. I stood there in the freezing night, processing what I'd learned, adding new details to Morrison's notebook, documenting another encounter with the guardians of the path. I started visiting historical societies and libraries during my off hours, researching the Mohawk Trail's history before the modern road existed. What I found was fascinating and troubling. The trail itself dated back thousands of years, used by indigenous peoples not just for travel, but for spiritual purposes. There were specific sites along the route that were considered sacred, places where visions were sought, where ceremonies were conducted, where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was traditionally understood to be thin. In 1914, when the Mohawk Trail was developed as one of America's first scenic tourist routes, those sacred sites were simply paved over. No consultation with native peoples. No acknowledgement of the trail's spiritual significance. Just enthusiastic promotion of a beautiful drive through the mountains, complete with gift shops and scenic overlooks built directly on top of ceremonial sites. One historical document I found particularly revealing was a letter from 1919, written by a Mohawk leader named Thomas Oakes to the Massachusetts Department of Transportation. In the letter, Oakes pleaded with state officials to relocate certain sections of the road to honor the boundary markers that still existed along the route. He wrote, "These stones mark places where the world of spirits and the world of flesh grow close. To build your roads through these places without proper ceremony and protection is to invite tragedy. The path remembers. The guardians are patient, but not forgiving." The letter was filed away without response. Road construction continued, and within a year of the route's completion, the first modern disappearance occurred. A tourist from Boston, gone without a trace while hiking near the hairpin turn. His vehicle was found with the door open and the engine running. The pattern had been established. The boundary had been violated, and people began paying the price. I also learned about earlier disappearances before the modern road existed. Native American oral histories, documented by anthropologists in the early 20th century, spoke of people who'd violated boundary protocols even in traditional times. Hunters who'd entered restricted areas without proper preparation. Young people who'd ignored elder wisdom and walked forbidden paths. The difference was that indigenous communities understood what had happened to these people. They performed ceremonies to honor the lost, to maintain the balance that the violations had threatened. When the modern road came, those ceremonies stopped. The knowledge faded, and the disappearances became mysteries rather than understood consequences. By late spring, I'd documented 19 boundary encounters in Morrison's notebook. These ranged from minor incidents, vehicles I'd redirected using routine traffic stops, to more serious events where I'd physically had to prevent people from entering the forest during high-risk periods. In each case, I felt that static electricity sensation, that warning from the boundary itself that someone vulnerable was approaching. One incident in particular stood out. It was late April, just past midnight, when I encountered a man in his 50s walking along the shoulder of Route 2 near mile marker 26. No vehicle nearby, no explanation for why he'd be on foot in that location at that hour. He was wearing pajamas and slippers, completely inappropriate for the cold spring night. "Sir, are you okay?" I asked, pulling up beside him, activating my lights. "Do you need assistance?" He stopped walking and turned to look at me. His eyes were unfocused, as if he was sleepwalking or in some kind of fugue state. "I hear them," he said, "calling from the trees. They say my daughter is there. They say if I come to her, I can say goodbye properly." I felt the cold from Morrison's pouch immediately. This man was being actively called by the boundary, drawn by whatever entities existed beyond the threshold. "Sir, what's your name? Where are you coming from?" "Thomas Brennan," he said. "I'm from Charlemont. My daughter Emily died 3 months ago. Car accident on this road. She was 23. They say she walks here now. They say I can see her if I just follow the voices." I got out of my cruiser carefully, approaching Thomas with my hands visible, non-threatening. "Mr. Brennan, I'm very sorry for your loss. But what you're hearing isn't your daughter. It's not real." "How do you know?" His voice broke. "How can you be sure? Maybe she's trapped here. Maybe she needs help." This was the cruelty of the boundary. It didn't just take people randomly. It exploited grief, used loss as bait, offered false hope of reunion or closure. And I had to be the one to destroy that hope, to deny him even the comfort of believing his daughter might still exist in some form. "I know, because I've been where you're being called to. Go," I told him. "I've crossed that boundary and come back. And I promise you, what's on the other side isn't your daughter. It might look like her. It might sound like her. But it's not her. It's something using your grief to draw you in." Thomas stared at me, tears running down his face. "You've seen them? The people who walk?" "Yes. And they're not suffering. They're not in pain. But they're not who they were anymore. And if you go to them, you won't find closure. You'll just join them. Is that what Emily would want for you?" That question broke through his fugue state. He collapsed, sobbing, and I helped him back to my cruiser. I called for medical support, had him evaluated for psychiatric crisis, made sure he got connected with grief counselors and support services. But I also gave him my card and told him to call me directly if he ever felt the call again. "The voices?" he asked before the ambulance took him away. "Do they ever stop?" "They're quieter away from the boundary," I said. "Stay out of the mountains during the vulnerable times. Spring and autumn particularly. New moon nights especially. And if you feel drawn to the trail, if you hear anything calling you, get somewhere with people and noise and light. The boundary has less power in places like that." I added Thomas Brennan's incident to the notebook. Another person saved, another tragedy prevented, but also another person who would carry the burden of knowing what existed in those mountains, another life forever shadowed by proximity to the threshold. Summer brought its own challenges. Tourist season meant more traffic on the Mohawk Trail, more people stopping at scenic overlooks, more opportunities for boundary violations. I worked extended hours, coordinated with other guardians in the region, made sure someone was always watching during the high-risk periods. I also started noticing secondary effects of my guardian status. Technology failed around me more frequently than it should. Compasses spun when I held them. Digital watches lost time or gained time unpredictably. My body camera footage increasingly showed strange artifacts, shadows that moved wrong, sounds that shouldn't have been there. I was carrying enough boundary resonance now that I was affecting equipment the same way the boundary itself did. Morrison noticed and told me it was normal for guardians who'd been active for several months. "You're marked now," he said. "Part of you exists in both worlds. The boundary recognizes you as its own. That's why you can sense things other people can't. That's why you can sometimes see the walkers even when they're not fully manifested." He was right. I started seeing the walkers more frequently, not just during direct boundary encounters, but in peripheral vision while patrolling. Shadows that moved through the forest, following paths I couldn't see. Figures standing at tree lines at dawn and dusk. Once, driving past mile marker 19 just after sunset, saw a line of walkers crossing the road itself, moving from one section of forest to another, completely oblivious to traffic. I slowed down, let them pass, and continued on. No one else on the road seemed to see them. In July, I had my first encounter with another type of boundary phenomenon. I responded to a report of a vehicle accident near mile marker 33, expecting the usual scenario of someone taking a curve too fast or swerving to avoid wildlife. What I found was stranger. The vehicle was a newer Toyota Camry, completely undamaged, sitting perfectly positioned in the breakdown lane with the engine running and headlights on. But when I checked the interior, I found the driver slumped over the steering wheel, unconscious. No injuries visible. No smell of alcohol. No signs of medical emergency like stroke or heart attack. Just unconscious. I called for medical response and began checking the man's vitals. Pulse was slow but steady. Breathing was shallow but regular. And his body temperature was 89 degrees, borderline hypothermic despite the warm July evening. When the paramedics arrived and loaded him into the ambulance, he started convulsing, muttering words that didn't make sense. "The path shows all times at once," he kept saying. "I saw yesterday and tomorrow, and the day I die. The path shows everything." The man, whose name was David Keller, recovered after 2 days in the hospital. When I interviewed him, he described an experience that matched accounts I'd read in other guardians' notebooks. He'd pulled over to check his phone, felt an overwhelming urge to look at the forest, and in that moment of attention, something had shown him time differently. Not linear past to future, but all moments simultaneously, his entire life spread out like a landscape he could see all at once. "I saw my death," he told me, his hands shaking. Not in any dramatic way, just, I was old, in a hospital bed, my daughter holding my hand. And I saw every major moment between now and then, every choice, every consequence, every fork in the path. It was too much. My brain couldn't process it. I just shut down. This was a new aspect of the boundary I hadn't encountered before. Not transformation into a walker, not physical disappearance, but exposure to non-linear time that human consciousness couldn't properly integrate. Morrison confirmed it was a known phenomenon. The boundary doesn't just divide physical space, he explained. It divides temporal space. Past and future are thinner there. Some people who get too close catch glimpses they're not meant to see. By August, I'd prevented 14 more potential boundary crossings. Some were easy, obvious cases of vehicles breaking down in wrong places at wrong times. Others were harder, people who seemed genuinely called by something, who described hearing voices or seeing figures or feeling absolutely certain they needed to enter the forest at specific locations. One woman, an artist from Connecticut named Jennifer Marsh, told me she'd been dreaming about the Mohawk Trail for months. "The dreams are so vivid," she said. "I walk through these woods, and there are people there. They're working on something, some kind of pattern or design I can't quite see. And they tell me I'm supposed to join them, that my art is needed for whatever they're creating." I convinced her to turn around, to take a different route home. But her description troubled me. It suggested the boundary wasn't just passive, wasn't just waiting for people to stumble across it. It was actively recruiting, reaching out through dreams and visions to find people with specific qualities or vulnerabilities. I added this information to Morrison's notebook and sent copies to other guardians through our informal network. Within a week, I'd received responses from 3 other locations describing similar dream reports. The boundaries were communicating with each other somehow, coordinating their recruitment efforts. This wasn't random. This was organized, intentional, purposeful. In September, as autumn began and the boundary entered its most active period, I met Joseph Canote again. He contacted me through Morrison, asking if we could talk privately about developments along the Mohawk Trail. We met at a diner in Charlemont, far enough from the boundary zone to speak freely. "The guardians are growing restless," Joseph told me, ordering coffee that he didn't touch. "Not the human guardians like you, the other ones, the void figures, the walkers. Something's changing. The balance is shifting." "What do you mean?" "My grandfather used to say that the boundary was like a wound that never fully healed. Colonial violations tore reality there, and the natural order adapted by creating guardians and walkers and rules to prevent further damage. But wounds can get infected. They can fester. And I think that's happening now." He pulled out a map of western Massachusetts, marked with locations I recognized from Morrison's notebook and information shared by other guardians. "Look at the pattern," Joseph said. "Disappearances are increasing, not just along the Mohawk Trail, but at all the boundary sites across New England. 10 years ago, we averaged maybe 20 incidents per year across all locations. Last year, it was 47. This year, we're already at 53, with 3 months still to go. Why? What's changed?" "I think the boundaries are expanding," Joseph said grimly. "Climate change is altering the landscape. Development is pushing further into wilderness areas. More people are visiting these places, and many of them come with spiritual trauma, psychological crisis, exactly the kind of vulnerability the boundaries exploit. The guardians can't keep up. Too many people, too many entry points, too few of us to watch everything." He was right. I'd been feeling overwhelmed myself, running extended shifts, responding to more boundary-related incidents than I had time or resources to properly address. And I was just one guardian in one location. If this pattern was replicating across all boundary sites, the system was breaking down. "There's something else," Joseph said. "Traditional ceremonies and protections are breaking down too. My people, we maintain certain practices for generations to keep the boundaries stable. But as we've lost connection to traditional lands, as younger generations have moved away or lost cultural knowledge, those practices have faded. And without them, the boundaries are becoming more aggressive, more desperate. They're reaching out further, calling louder, taking more people. What can we do? I don't know, Joseph admitted. Traditional solutions require traditional access and knowledge, but the legal and cultural structures that would enable that access don't exist anymore. We can't just go perform ceremonies on state highway property or in national parks. And even if we could, we'd need elders with knowledge that's mostly been lost. We sat in silence for a while, drinking coffee that had gone cold, contemplating a problem that seemed to have no solution. The boundaries existed. They were expanding. And we, the informal network of guardians, could only slow the inevitable increase in disappearances, not stop it entirely. Keep your notebook current, Joseph finally said. Keep sharing information with other guardians. And if you ever need traditional guidance or ceremony, contact me. I'll do what I can, even if it's not as much as my grandfather could have done. October brought the full intensity of boundary activity. The autumn colors were spectacular that year, bringing thousands of tourists through the Mohawk Trail. And with them came incident after incident. In the first 3 weeks of October alone, I turned back 23 vehicles from high-risk areas, interrupted 11 people who'd left their cars to enter the forest, and discovered 4 abandoned vehicles whose drivers had crossed the boundary before I could intervene. 4 more walkers joined the eternal path. 4 more people transformed from human to something other, lost to families who would never know what happened to them. And I had to carry that weight, knowing that if I'd been faster, more vigilant, better at my job, maybe I could have saved them. One of those 4 was a teenager, 17 years old, named Marcus Chen. No relation to Deputy Chen in Maine, just a tragic coincidence of names. Marcus had been struggling with depression and suicidal ideation, according to his parents. He'd left home in Springfield late one night, driven to the Mohawk Trail, and walked into the forest near mile marker 27. His car was found the next morning. I was called to the scene and recognized immediately what had happened. The footprints in the frost, the boundary markers nearby, the complete absence of any trail leading back out of the forest. Marcus had crossed, had been vulnerable to the boundary's call, and had accepted transformation rather than returning to a life that had become unbearable. I added Marcus Chen to the growing list in Morrison's notebook. Another name, another person who'd found an escape from suffering, but at the cost of their humanity and at the price of their family's eternal uncertainty about what had happened. That incident broke something in me. I'd been operating under the assumption that I was protecting people, saving them from a fate worse than death. But was it worse than death? For someone like Marcus, who'd been in so much pain that any alternative seemed preferable, was walking the eternal path really a terrible outcome? The void figure had told me the walkers didn't suffer. They existed in transformed state, yes, but not in torment. I shared these thoughts with Morrison during a late-night conversation at the end of October. He listened quietly, then showed me an entry in his notebook from 2012. I stopped a woman tonight, the entry read. Stage 4 cancer, given months to live, in constant pain, despite medications. She told me she'd been dreaming about the path, that it called to her, offering release. I turned her back, sent her to drive home to her family. And I watched her cry as she drove away, knowing I'd condemned her to months of agony when the path was offering peaceful transformation. Did I do the right thing? I don't know anymore. The boundary offers something we can't. escape from suffering. But at what cost? And do I have the right to make that choice for others? Morrison looked at me with weary eyes. That woman died 3 months later, he said. Hospice care, surrounded by family. Her death was hard but human. Would the path have been better? Maybe. But once we start making exceptions, start deciding who deserves to cross and who doesn't, we've stopped being guardians and started playing God. But we're already playing God, I argued. We're deciding who can and can't access the path. We're enforcing boundaries that deny people choices they might legitimately want to make. True, Morrison acknowledged. And that's the burden. That's what makes this duty so hard. We're not just protecting people from danger. We're maintaining a prohibition they might actively want to violate. And we have to live with that, knowing some of the people we turn back would have chosen the path if given full information and agency. November came, marking a full year since my crossing. The boundary was maximally active during this period, and I worked nearly continuous shifts, sleeping in my cruiser during brief breaks, surviving on coffee and sandwiches from gas stations. Other guardians came to help, taking temporary assignments in the Mohawk Trail region to provide coverage during the crisis period. On November 3rd, exactly 1 year after I'd crossed the boundary and returned, I had my most significant encounter with the void figures since that first night. I was patrolling near mile marker 28, the exact location where Rebecca Morrison's car had been found, when I saw something I'd never witnessed before. The walkers were gathering, not in their usual scattered patrols through the forest, but in a concentrated group near one of the carved boundary stones. There were dozens of them, maybe more than 100, standing in concentric circles around the stone. And in the center, barely visible even with my boundary-enhanced perception, was something larger than the others. Something that radiated authority and power in ways the individual guardians and walkers didn't. I approached carefully, the leather pouch Morrison had given me so cold against my chest that it burned. "Hello?" I called out. "I'm Guardian Whitmore. I keep the watch on this section of the boundary." The circles of walkers parted, creating a path toward the central figure. It moved forward, and as it came closer, I could see it was different from the void figures I'd encountered before. This entity had more substance, more presence. It looked almost human. An elderly man in traditional Native American clothing. But the eyes were wrong. They held the same darkness as the walker's eyes, but with awareness and intelligence the walkers lacked. "Guardian," the figure said, and unlike the telepathic communication of the void figures, this voice had sound, resonance, physical presence. "1 year you have served. 1 year you have kept the watch. The boundary acknowledges your duty." "Thank you," I said, unsure of proper protocol for this situation. "I'm trying to protect people, to prevent unnecessary crossings." "Unnecessary," the figure repeated, and there might have been amusement in the tone. "Who defines necessity, Guardian? You stop those who seek escape. You turn back those who hear the call. But do you understand what you protect them from, or what you deny them access to?" "I protect them from losing their humanity," I said, "from becoming walkers, from being lost to their families and communities." "Humanity," the figure said. "Such a limited concept. Humanity is choice. Humanity is change. Humanity is understanding that existence takes many forms. The walkers are not lost, Guardian. They have become. they have transformed. They serve purposes your limited perception cannot comprehend. The figure gestured toward the circles of walkers. Each one chose to cross. Each one accepted transformation. Each one serves the boundary that keeps your reality stable. Without them, without their eternal patrol, the violations your ancestors committed would have torn the fabric of existence. The walkers are not victims, Guardian. They are heroes protecting a world that doesn't know they exist. This was a perspective I'd never considered, that the walkers weren't tragic losses, but necessary guardians themselves, maintaining reality through their transformed existence. Then why do you need human guardians like me? Why not just let everyone who wants to cross become walkers? Balance, the figure said simply. Too many walkers and the boundary dissolves entirely, merging your reality with ours in catastrophic fusion. Too few walkers and the boundary cannot sustain itself against ongoing violations. Human guardians regulate the flow. You turn back those who cross impulsively, without understanding. You let through those who truly choose, who accept transformation with full awareness. You maintain equilibrium. But I don't let anyone through, I protested. I turn everyone back. That's my duty. Do you? The figure tilted its head, and I felt sudden doubt. How many of the people I'd encountered had actually been turned back versus how many had managed to cross despite my efforts? How many had I genuinely saved versus how many had simply been delayed until they found another opportunity? The boundary will have what it needs, the figure continued. Your duty is not to prevent all crossings, but to prevent wrong crossings. The boundary calls those it requires. Your role is to test them, to ensure they truly choose transformation rather than stumbling into it through ignorance or accident. You are not a wall, Guardian. You are a gate. And sometimes, gates must open. The figure raised one hand, and the circles of walkers began to move, resuming their eternal patrol through the forest. 1 year you have served faithfully. Many years more you will serve. And when your time comes, when the boundary calls you not as guardian, but as walker, you will understand fully what you have protected and what you have preserved. Go back to your watch, Guardian Whitmore. The boundary is satisfied with your service. The figure faded, not walking away, but simply ceasing to be visible, and the walkers dispersed into the forest darkness. I stood there for a long time, processing what I'd been told, questioning everything I'd believed about my role and duty. Was I really saving people? Or was I just controlling who got access to transformation? And if the walkers were actually serving important purposes, maintaining reality itself through their eternal patrol, was I doing harm by preventing people from joining them? I shared this encounter with Joseph Kenote the next day. He listened carefully, then shared his own knowledge from traditional teachings. My grandfather said the walkers were necessary, Joseph told me, that they were part of the natural order, not a violation of it. The violation was the boundary itself, the tear in reality caused by colonial actions. The walkers and guardians both exist to heal that tear, to maintain stability until the deeper healing can occur. What deeper healing? Reconciliation, Joseph said. Recognition of indigenous sovereignty and traditional relationships with the land. Formal acknowledgement of the boundaries and proper ceremonies to honor them. Restoration of practices that maintained balance for thousands of years before colonization disrupted everything. But that healing requires societal changes that haven't happened yet and might never happen. Over the next few months, I learned to recognize people who were genuinely called by the boundary versus people who approached it through accident or ignorance. The genuinely called had a quality I learned to perceive, a resonance or harmony with the boundary's energy. They weren't running from something, they were moving toward something. And they often had knowledge they shouldn't have. Awareness of the boundary's nature, understanding of transformation, acceptance of the cost. I still turned most people back, but occasionally, very occasionally, I encountered someone who I knew was meant to cross. And in those cases, I didn't obstruct them. I simply bore witness, documented the crossing, and added them to Morrison's notebook with the notation, called and accepted. These decisions weighed heavily on me. Each person I let cross was someone's child, parent, sibling, friend. Each crossing created grief and uncertainty for those left behind. But if the entity at the boundary gathering was correct, if the walkers truly served essential purposes, then preventing all crossings would eventually destabilize reality itself. The burden of being a guardian wasn't just preventing crossings. It was making impossible choices about who should cross and who shouldn't. It was accepting that some losses were necessary to prevent greater catastrophes. It was living with the weight of playing gatekeeper to transformation. Sometimes it was easy. A broken down vehicle just needed a tow back to the last town. A confused driver just needed clear directions to a different route. But sometimes it was harder. Sometimes people insisted on proceeding. Sometimes they argued that they had the right to travel any public road. And then I had to make a choice. Be forceful in my obstruction, potentially facing disciplinary action for exceeding my authority, or let them pass and potentially condemn them to walk the eternal path. I chose obstruction every time during my first year. But as I learned to recognize those genuinely called by the boundary, my approach evolved. I became more selective, more nuanced. I learned to ask questions that revealed whether someone was approaching through ignorance or through deeper calling. And I learned to live with the consequences of my decisions. By my second year as a guardian, the personal costs of my duty had become severe. My marriage was failing. My wife didn't understand why I worked such long hours, why I was so secretive about certain aspects of my job, why I sometimes woke up in the middle of the night and immediately checked my phone for reports from the Mohawk Trail region. I couldn't explain the truth, and lies of omission eventually destroyed the trust between us. We separated in March of my second year, divorced by June. My relationship with my children suffered too. My son was 14, my daughter 11, and both of them struggled to understand why Dad was always working, always distracted, always somewhere else, even when physically present. I tried to be there for important events, but guardian duty didn't respect school plays or soccer games. The boundary didn't care if I had parental responsibilities. It demanded attention whenever it grew active, and people's lives depended on my response. The isolation was crushing. I couldn't share my experiences with anyone outside the small network of guardians. I couldn't seek counseling for the psychological trauma of my crossing, because explaining what had traumatized me would sound delusional. I couldn't talk to friends or family about the weight I carried, because the truth was too strange, too dark, too incomprehensible to anyone who hadn't experienced it directly. Other guardians understood. We shared our burdens through encrypted messages and rare in-person meetings, speaking in coded language, even among ourselves, out of habit and caution. Ranger Sarah Childress from Vermont told me she'd lost her partner of 12 years because she couldn't explain why she sometimes drove 3 hours in the middle of the night to check on a trail section. Deputy Marcus Chen from Maine said his adult children had staged an intervention, convinced he was developing paranoid schizophrenia because he talked about boundaries and guardians and entities that they couldn't see or verify. This duty destroys normal life, Sergeant Morrison told me during one of our late-night conversations at a rest stop between patrol zones. It has to. Normal life is built on comfortable illusions about how reality works. We can't maintain those illusions anymore. We've seen behind the curtain. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Can't pretend it doesn't exist. Can't go back to believing the world is simple and safe and comprehensible. He was right. I'd been fundamentally changed by my crossing. My perception of reality had expanded in ways that made ordinary existence feel hollow and false. I saw the world, now, as multiple layers, with the surface layer of consensus reality floating atop deeper strata where different rules applied. I saw time not as simple, linear progression, but as something more complex, more fluid, more negotiable than most people realized. And I saw people not just as physical beings, but as energy patterns that could be transformed, translated, transcended under the right or wrong circumstances. This expanded perception made me better at my guardian duties, but worse at everything else. I couldn't watch TV shows or movies without noticing all the ways they got reality wrong. I couldn't read news articles about missing persons without wondering if boundary crossings were involved. I couldn't attend social gatherings without feeling the fundamental alienation of knowing truths I couldn't share, of being unable to participate in the comfortable ignorance everyone else enjoyed. In my second year, I started keeping a personal journal separate from Morrison's official notebook. The official notebook documented incidents and encounters in dry, factual language. My personal journal explored the philosophical and psychological implications of guardian duty, worked through the moral questions that haunted me. One entry from August 2025 read, "Turned back a woman today who begged me to let her continue. Stage 3 breast cancer. Prognosis poor. Treatment making her miserable. She'd read something online about the Mohawk Trail being a place of transformation, a place where suffering could end. Don't know how she learned about the boundary, but she knew. Really knew. Not just hoping or fantasizing. She understood what crossing would mean. And she wanted it, chose it, begged for it. I turned her back anyway, because that's the protocol. Because I'm supposed to protect people even from their own informed choices. But who am I protecting? Her? Or the illusion that death is the only legitimate escape from suffering? Drove home tonight feeling like I'd committed a profound violation. Like I'd denied someone agency over their own existence in service of rules I don't fully understand or agree with anymore. These moral complications intensified as I encountered more people who were genuinely called by the boundary. Some were suffering terminal illness. Some had experienced trauma so severe that transformation seemed preferable to continued existence with those memories. Some were simply tired of human life, ready for whatever came next, willing to accept unknown transformation over known pain. And I had to decide, case by case, whether to let them through or turn them back. The entity at the November gathering had told me I was a gate that sometimes had to open. But determining when to open and when to stay closed was an impossible burden no human should have to carry alone. In November 2025, 2 years after my initial crossing, I encountered a situation that forced me to confront the deepest implications of my role. A young man, 26 years old, named Daniel Rivera, pulled over near mile marker 25 during a night when the boundary was maximally active. I approached his vehicle, following standard procedure, but before I could speak, he looked at me with absolute clarity and said, "You're a guardian. I can see it around you. The boundaries mark." "Sir, I need you to move your vehicle," I responded, trying to deflect. "This area isn't safe for parking." "I'm not here by accident, Guardian," Daniel said. "I've been preparing for 3 years, researching, learning, understanding what I'm choosing. I know what the boundary is. I know what crossing means, and I'm ready." I felt the familiar static electricity, but stronger than usual. This wasn't someone being called by the boundary. This was someone actively seeking it with full knowledge and preparation. "You understand you'll cease to be human?" I asked. "That you'll become a walker, eternally patrolling the threshold?" "I understand I'll become part of something larger than individual existence," Daniel replied. "I'll serve the boundary. I'll help maintain reality. I'll transform from temporary human into eternal guardian. That's not loss, trooper. That's evolution." "Your family have said goodbye," Daniel interrupted. "I told them I was terminally ill, which is true in its way. Terminal humanity. Fatal case of being unable to exist in ordinary reality anymore. They had closure. They'll grieve, but they won't search for me. I've prepared everything properly." I stood there in the cold November night, facing someone who challenged every assumption I'd built about my guardian duties. Daniel wasn't running from anything. He was choosing transformation deliberately, with full awareness, after years of preparation. He'd even considered the impact on his family and handled it. This was exactly the kind of crossing the entity had suggested should be allowed. But protocol said I should turn everyone back. Protocol said I should protect people from the boundary regardless of their wishes. Protocol said my duty was prevention, not facilitation. "Guardian," Daniel said quietly, "you've been doing this for 2 years. You've seen walkers. You've spoken with the entities. You know they serve important purposes. The boundary needs walkers to maintain stability. And some humans are meant to become walkers, are called to that service. Are you going to deny the boundary what it legitimately needs? Are you going to refuse someone the right to choose transcendence over ordinary existence?" I thought about Rebecca Morrison, about Marcus Chen, about all the others who'd crossed through ignorance or accident or desperation. And I thought about the weight of preventing someone from making an informed choice about their own existence. "If I let you through," I said slowly, "I'm complicit in your transformation. I become responsible for whatever consequences follow." "No," Daniel corrected. "If you let me through, you're respecting my agency. You're acknowledging that transformation is a legitimate choice, not just a tragedy to be prevented. The only responsibility you have is to ensure I'm making this choice freely and with full awareness, which I am." I made my decision. "Walk carefully," I told him. "Honor the stones, respect the guardians you'll meet, and serve well." Daniel nodded once, then left his vehicle and walked toward the tree line. I watched him go, documenting the crossing in Morrison's notebook, marking it as called and accepted. and I stood there long after he disappeared into the forest, wondering if I'd done the right thing or if I'd just failed in my most fundamental duty. 2 weeks later, I encountered Daniel again, not as a human, but as a walker. He was patrolling the boundary near mile marker 28, moving with that same measured pace all walkers displayed, but something in his movement seemed purposeful, aware. When I approached, he stopped and turned toward me. "Guardian," he said, and his voice had that quality of being everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. "Thank you for opening the gate. My service has begun. The boundary is strengthened by my choice." Are you still Daniel?" I asked. "Or are you something else now?" "Both," he replied. "Neither. I am the memory of Daniel transformed into eternal function. I am individual consciousness expanded into boundary service. I am human choice becoming reality maintenance." The question assumes false dichotomy between Daniel and Walker. I am continuous with what I was while being fundamentally different. This is the nature of transcendence. He continued his patrol, leaving me with more questions than answers. But seeing him, seeing that his choice had been honored and that he served with purpose rather than wandering lost, gave me some peace about my decision. I'd allowed an informed crossing. I'd respected someone's agency, and the boundary had been strengthened by a walker who chose service rather than stumbling into it. Over the next several months, I continued to refine my approach to guardian duty. I learned to distinguish between different types of boundary approaches. Some people needed to be turned back firmly, their approaches driven by temporary crisis or impulsive decision-making. Others needed conversation and counseling, their approaches driven by suffering that might be addressed through conventional means. And a very small number needed to be allowed through, their approaches driven by genuine calling and informed choice. The statistics in Morrison's notebook reflected this evolution. During my first year, I prevented 37 crossings with 0 allowed passages. During my second year, I prevented 52 crossings, but allowed 3 passages. During my third year, I prevented 68 crossings, but allowed 7 passages. The boundary was becoming more active, calling more people, but I was becoming more discerning about who truly belonged on the path versus who was approaching through temporary crisis. Other guardians in the network noticed this shift. Some approved, agreeing that informed choice should be respected even when it resulted in transformation. Others disagreed, arguing that any crossing was a failure of guardian duty. That protection meant absolute prevention. These debates happened in encrypted group messages and rare gatherings, passionate arguments about the nature of our duty and the ethics of our decisions. Sergeant Morrison remained neutral publicly, but told me privately that he agreed with my approach. "I've been a guardian for 17 years, he said, and I've watched dozens of people cross despite my best efforts. The ones who truly choose it, who accept transformation with awareness, they serve better as walkers. They're purposeful. The ones who cross accidentally or desperately, they're more chaotic, less integrated into the boundaries functioning. If we're going to have walkers anyway, and we are because the boundary needs them, better they be walkers who chose the role than victims who stumbled into it." In my 4th year as a guardian, I experienced what other long-term guardians had warned me about. The boundary started affecting me more directly. My dreams became increasingly strange, populated by void figures and walkers, by visions of the path stretching across dimensions I couldn't normally perceive. My waking perception shifted too. I could sometimes see the boundary markers even when I wasn't near the Mohawk Trail, as if my awareness had expanded to detect all the thin places in reality, not just the specific section I officially patrolled. The leather pouch Morrison had given me was now permanently cold against my chest. The protective herbs and carved bone inside had become part of my physiology somehow, integrated into my energy pattern in ways that made me more boundary entity than human. I still ate and slept and performed normal biological functions, but I existed partially in multiple realities simultaneously, my consciousness spanning thresholds most people couldn't detect. This transformation scared me initially. I feared I was slowly becoming like the walkers, losing my humanity to boundary service. But Morrison assured me this was normal for guardians who served past 3 years. We're not becoming walkers, he explained. We're becoming living bridges. We exist in both worlds simultaneously, which is why we can guard the boundary effectively. Full humans can't perceive what needs guarding. Walkers can't interact with humans to turn them back. We occupy the middle space, the liminal state that makes guardian duty possible. He showed me entries from his predecessor's notebook, entries from a guardian who'd served for 23 years before retiring. The entries described similar experiences: expanded perception, dream visitations, physical changes that made the guardian more boundary entity than ordinary human. But they also described eventual stabilization, a point where the transformation reached equilibrium and the guardian could function indefinitely in that liminal state. You're not losing your humanity, Morrison said. You're expanding it, becoming something more than human, but not less. It's frightening because Western culture has no framework for understanding liminality as anything but loss. But indigenous traditions recognize liminal beings as necessary and valuable. You're becoming what those traditions called a walker between worlds. This reframing helped me accept the changes I was experiencing. I wasn't degenerating into something monstrous. I was evolving into something necessary, a being capable of bridging realities in service of maintaining stability between them. The loneliness and isolation didn't diminish, but I understood them now as consequences of occupying spaces most humans couldn't access or comprehend. In late 2027, nearly 4 years after my initial crossing, I attended my first gathering of guardians from across New England. Morrison organized it, bringing together 14 people who served boundary zones in Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. We met at a cabin deep in the White Mountains, far from any boundary zone, in neutral territory where we could speak freely. The gathering was revelatory. I'd known about other guardians through the Notebook Network, but meeting them in person was different. I saw clearly that we all carried the same markers, the same liminal quality that marked us as beings who existed between worlds. And I heard stories that paralleled mine: crossings and returns, impossible choices, gradual transformation into something more and less than human. One guardian, a woman named Patricia Oakes, who patrolled boundary zones in Vermont's Green Mountains, had been serving for 31 years. She was the longest-serving guardian any of us knew, and she'd become something extraordinary. She could perceive the entire network of boundaries across New England simultaneously, seeing the web of thin places and understanding how they interconnected. She could communicate with walkers and void figures without needing to approach specific sites. And she radiated a peaceful acceptance that gave the rest of us hope that long-term service was sustainable. The hardest part isn't the duty itself, Patricia told us. It's maintaining connection to human life while serving the boundary. But that connection is essential. If we lose our humanity entirely, we become walkers ourselves, incapable of guarding because we've joined what we're guarding. We must remain liminal, suspended between worlds, belonging fully to neither. She gave us practical advice about maintaining that humanity. Regular contact with non-guardian people, even if those relationships were superficial. Engagement with ordinary activities and pleasures. Deliberate cultivation of interests and hobbies unrelated to boundary duty. The boundary will consume you if you let it, she warned. You must actively resist total integration. You must maintain some part of yourself that's still ordinary, still human, still connected to the world you're protecting. This gathering became an annual tradition. We met each October, during the period when boundary activity peaked, to share information, provide mutual support, and maintain our humanity through connection with the only people who truly understood our duty and experience. By my 5th year as a guardian, I'd achieved something like equilibrium. I'd rebuilt relationships with my children, though they still didn't fully understand my work. I'd found a routine that balanced guardian duty with enough ordinary life to remain grounded. And I'd accepted that my expanded perception and liminal existence, while isolating, served important purposes I couldn't have served as a fully ordinary human. I'd also become senior guardian for the Mohawk Trail region. Morrison retired in 2028, passing his notebook and responsibilities to me. I inherited oversight of a zone that now required constant vigilance, coordinating with newer guardians who patrolled specific sections while I maintained awareness of the entire corridor. The crossings continued. Some I prevented, some I allowed. Each decision carried weight, but I'd learned to trust my expanded perception to distinguish between approaches that needed obstruction and approaches that needed facilitation. The boundary guided me in ways I didn't fully understand, but had learned to trust. In 2029, Joseph Canote passed away. His death was expected. He'd been battling cancer for 2 years, but it still hit me hard. Joseph had been my first teacher about the boundary, the person who'd helped me understand what I'd experienced when I couldn't make sense of it myself. He'd served as an unofficial guardian in his own way, though he'd never crossed the boundary or received the call to become a walker. He'd simply carried traditional knowledge and used it to protect people through education and cultural preservation. His funeral was held at the Akwesasne Mohawk Nation. I attended in uniform, representing not just the Massachusetts State Police, but the entire Guardian network. During the ceremony, Joseph's grandson approached me with a leather-bound journal. "Grandfather wanted you to have this," he said. It's his translations of the boundary stones, combined with traditional teachings about the paths and the guardians. He said you'd know what to do with it. I took the journal with profound gratitude. Inside were detailed translations of the symbols carved into stones along the Mohawk Trail and other boundary zones, explanations of traditional ceremonies that maintain balance, stories about how indigenous peoples had managed the boundaries for thousands of years before colonization disrupted those practices, and practical guidance about guardian duties from traditional perspectives rather than just survival knowledge passed down through guardian notebooks. This journal became as essential to my work as Morrison's notebook. It provided context and deeper understanding that improved my guardian effectiveness immeasurably. And it connected my duty to a much longer tradition of boundary maintenance, helping me see my role not as something new and strange, but as continuation of ancient practices adapted to modern circumstances. Now, here in January 2030, I've been a guardian for over 6 years. I'm 43 years old, marked by boundary service in ways that will never fully heal, serving a duty that will likely continue until I die, or choose to cross the boundary myself and become a walker. I chose obstruction every time. I've been written up 14 times for overreach. I've been accused of harassment by travelers who didn't understand why I was refusing to let them continue. I've lost opportunities for promotion because my service record now includes multiple complaints about my conduct during traffic stops along the Mohawk Trail. But I've also turned back 37 vehicles from the boundary during times when crossing would have been dangerous. I've saved 37 groups of people from joining Rebecca Morrison and all the others who walked the path. And I've learned more about the boundary than I ever wanted to know. There are patterns. The path becomes most active during the autumn and winter months, specifically during the period between October 31st and February 2nd, dates that roughly correspond to ancient Celtic festivals, but also to traditional hunting seasons for many northeastern Native American tribes. The path's influence is strongest during the new moon, when darkness is deepest, and the path responds to certain types of people, drawing them more strongly than others. People in crisis, people running from something, people seeking escape or transformation. They're all more vulnerable to the call of the path. I've also learned that the boundary exists in other places beyond the Mohawk Trail. Sergeant Morrison's notebook documented sites across Massachusetts and throughout New England where similar phenomena occurred. There are locations in the Vermont mountains where hikers vanish. There are stretches of coastal Maine highway where vehicles are found abandoned with no trace of their drivers. There are old mill towns in Rhode Island where people report seeing figures walking in circles around crumbling factory buildings at night. All of these places share common elements. They're built on or near ancient Native American trails or sacred sites. They're locations where modern development ignored or paved over indigenous warnings. And they're all guarded in unofficial ways by people like me who learned the hard way what happens when boundaries are crossed without permission. Joseph Canoti had been right when he told me the trail walker wasn't malevolent. It wasn't evil in any human sense. It was simply a force, an entity, a system that existed according to its own rules. The tragedy wasn't that it existed, but that we, in our arrogance and ignorance, had built our roads and towns and lives right through places we didn't understand, breaking agreements we never knew existed, and then acting surprised when people paid the price for our violations. The notebook I inherited from Morrison contains protocols for dealing with boundary incidents. One of the key protocols is documentation. Every encounter, every strange occurrence, every person turned back from the threshold gets recorded in detail. Not for official police reports, which would never be believed, but for the next guardian who inherits the duty. Because that's how this works. Eventually, Morrison will retire or transfer, and someone else will take over his patrol sector. Eventually, I'll do the same. And the notebook will be passed on, the knowledge preserved, the duty continued. There's an entry in the notebook from 1973, written by a trooper named James Kowalski, who patrolled the Mohawk Trail during the oil crisis. He wrote, "Stopped at mile marker 19 tonight to help a family with a flat tire. While I was changing the tire, the father asked me if I believed in fate, if I thought everything happened for a reason. I told him I believed in cause and effect, action and consequence. He seemed disappointed by that answer, like he wanted something more mystical or meaningful. But the truth is, there's enough mystical in these mountains without making up more. The path exists because we failed to respect the boundaries. People walk it because we didn't teach them the rules. And we guard it because someone has to take responsibility for the mistakes of our ancestors. That's not fate. That's just consequence." I think about that entry a lot. About responsibility and consequence. About the weight of knowledge that can't be shared because no one would believe it without experiencing it themselves. And about the choice I made that November night when the void figure offered me a return to my world in exchange for service as a guardian. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice. Sometimes I wonder if I should have refused, should have accepted walking the eternal path rather than living with the burden of turning people back, of knowing what exists just beyond the boundary and being powerless to stop it from claiming new walkers when my vigilance fails. But then I remember Rebecca Morrison's voice on that 911 call, scared and alone. I remember the black-eyed figures walking their circles in the darkness. And I remember the 37 groups of people I've saved from that fate, the families and individuals who continued their lives never knowing how close they came to crossing a threshold from which there is no return. Last week, I responded to another call on the Mohawk Trail. Vehicle with engine trouble near mile marker 31, right at the heart of the boundary zone. It was 11 p.m. on a moonless night in January. All the conditions aligned for maximum path activity. When I arrived, I found a young couple, early 20s, their car genuinely broken down, steam rising from under the hood. They were college students from Boston, driving home from a winter camping trip. The young man was eager to investigate the forest, talking about how beautiful the area looked, even in the dark, how he wanted to take some nighttime photos. His girlfriend was more reluctant, saying she felt uncomfortable, that something felt wrong about the place. I watched as he walked toward the tree line, saw how his steps aligned with the direction that led toward the boundary stones, and I felt it, that static electricity sensation on my skin, that deep unease in my gut. The path was calling him. He was vulnerable to it in some way I couldn't identify, drawn toward crossing the threshold. In another few steps, he would have been past the point where I could easily stop him. "Sir, stop right there," I called out, using my command voice, the tone that expects immediate compliance. "This is protected watershed area. No public access beyond this point." It wasn't true. It wasn't protected watershed, but it was effective. The young man stopped, turned back, apologized for the confusion. I called for a tow truck, stayed with the couple until it arrived, and watched them leave, heading east toward civilization and safety and a life they would continue living without ever knowing what I'd protected them from. The girlfriend looked back as they drove away, her face visible in the rear window of the tow truck. She caught my eye for a moment, and I saw recognition there. Not understanding exactly, but awareness. She knew, on some instinctive level, that I'd saved them from something, that my lie about protected watershed had been a gift. I filed the incident report according to protocol. documented the date, time, location, and my actions. Added another entry to Morrison's notebook, which is now my notebook, which will someday be another guardian's notebook. And I went home at the end of my shift, carrying the weight of knowledge that most people will never have to bear. This is my life now. This is my duty. I patrol the highways of Western Massachusetts. I enforce the traffic laws. I help stranded motorists and respond to accidents and do all the normal work of a state trooper. But I also guard the boundary. I keep people from crossing into territory where our laws don't apply and different rules govern existence. I am the unofficial warden of a threshold that shouldn't exist, but does, the inheritor of a responsibility that goes back further than anyone can document. I'm telling you this now because it's been 8 months since my crossing. 8 months since I walked the path and returned. And in that time, 11 more people have vanished along the Mohawk Trail. During times when I wasn't on duty, during moments when the path was unguarded. 11 more people now walk the eternal circle, serving the law of the boundary, lost to their families and the world they knew. I can't be everywhere. I can't guard every moment. And that's why I'm breaking my silence. Not to convince you that what I've described is real, because I know how it sounds. Not to ask you to believe in void figures and eternal paths and boundaries between realities, but to give you information that might save your life if you find yourself on the Mohawk Trail between Charlemont and North Adams, particularly during the cold months, particularly at night. If you break down along that stretch of Route 2, stay with your vehicle. Do not investigate the forest. Do not follow sounds or lights, or the sense that you should walk into the trees. Wait for help to arrive, even if it takes hours. Call for assistance and then wait. If you see carved stones along the roadside or trail markers that look older than they should be, treat them with respect. Treat them as boundaries that shouldn't be crossed without knowledge you probably don't possess. The indigenous peoples who created those markers understood something we've forgotten, and their warnings are still valid even if we've forgotten how to read them. If your electronics start malfunctioning, if your compass spins, if your GPS shows your location jumping randomly, turn back. Don't proceed further. Those are signs that reality is growing thin, that the boundary is close. Return to the main road. Return to civilization, and thank whatever gods you believe in that you recognize the warning in time. And if you see figures in the forest, dark shapes that move like people but don't look quite right, don't approach them. Don't follow them. Don't speak to them unless they speak first. They're not hostile, but they're not entirely human anymore either. They serve purposes we don't fully understand, and engaging with them has consequences that can't be undone. Some of you watching this are from Massachusetts. Some of you have driven the Mohawk Trail and felt that wrongness, that sense of being watched or called toward the forest. Some of you might have even seen things you couldn't explain, experienced failures of technology or time that seemed impossible. Drop a comment if you have. Let me know that I'm not alone in carrying this knowledge. Let me know that others have felt what I've felt, seen what I've seen, and chosen to turn back while they still could. There's a phrase carved into several of the boundary stones, according to Joseph Connote's translation. The phrase appears to say something like, "The path respects those who respect the path." It's both a warning and an instruction. Respect the boundaries. Honor the agreements made by people who came before us. Acknowledge that our understanding of reality is limited and that ancient warnings exist for reasons we may not comprehend, but should still heed. I'm still a Massachusetts state trooper, still badge number 2847, still patrolling the same highways and back roads I've worked for 17 years. But I'm also something else now. I'm a guardian of thresholds, a keeper of boundaries, a living amendment to agreements broken by my ancestors when they paved their roads over sacred paths without asking permission or honoring the warnings carved in stone. This is the burden I carry. This is the price I paid for crossing the boundary and returning. And this is the knowledge I'm sharing with you now, in direct violation of the informal protocols that say we don't talk about what happens along the Mohawk Trail, that we maintain the fiction that it's just a scenic highway through beautiful mountains. I'm done with the fiction. I'm done with the silence that lets people vanish without warning. If breaking the code of silence means I face consequences from my fellow guardians or the state police hierarchy, so be it. At least I'll have done what I could to warn you. At least I'll have given you information that might save your life. Because the path is still there. The boundary still exists, and people will keep crossing it, driven by ignorance or crisis or the simple human tendency to ignore warnings we don't understand. All I can do is guard what I can guard, warn who I can warn, and accept that some people will walk the eternal circle no matter what I do to prevent it. The void figure told me that ignorance is not innocence, but I'm adding my own amendment to that statement. Ignorance without opportunity to learn might not be innocence, but it's also not justice. You deserve to know what exists in those mountains. You deserve to understand why vehicles are found abandoned with doors open and keys in the ignition. You deserve to know about Rebecca Morrison and the 146 others who vanished along that route since 1920, walking a path that leads somewhere we can't follow and shouldn't want to. The carved stones are still there, marking boundaries that our maps don't acknowledge. The path still waits, calling to those vulnerable to its influence. And somewhere in those dark forests, people walk in circles around central points we can't see, serving purposes we don't understand, lost to our world but not quite dead, transformed into something between human and other. This is the truth the Massachusetts State Police doesn't officially acknowledge. This is the reality that exists alongside our mapped and documented world. This is what I've experienced, what I've learned, and what I'm now sharing with you despite every protocol that says I should remain silent. If you're planning a trip through the Berkshires, drive during daylight. Stay on major roads. And if your vehicle breaks down along the Mohawk Trail between Charlemont and North Adams, especially during the cold months, especially at night, stay with your vehicle and wait for a state trooper to arrive. We're not just law enforcement. Some of us are guardians. Some of us know what you're in danger from. And some of us will do whatever it takes to keep you from crossing boundaries you don't even know exist. Welcome to Massachusetts. Welcome to the Mohawk Trail. And remember that some scenic routes are scenic because they hide their true nature behind beautiful autumn leaves and picturesque mountain vistas. What you can't see is always more important than what you can. What exists beyond the carved stones is always more powerful than what exists within our careful human boundaries. I'm Trooper Daniel Whitmore, badge number 2847. I patrol the threshold. I guard the boundary. And I'm telling you now, respect the path, honor the warnings, and never, ever cross the line marked by ancient stones without understanding what you're walking into. Because some paths, once walked, can never be retraced. Some boundaries, once crossed, change you forever. And some duties, once accepted, bind you until someone else takes your place, or you join those who walk the eternal circle in darkness and silence and cold that never ends. The boundary is real. The path is active. And the next time you drive through those beautiful mountains, remember that beauty often conceals danger, and ignorance is only bliss until the moment it becomes permanent transformation. Stay safe. Stay aware. And if you see a Massachusetts state trooper being unnecessarily cautious about letting you proceed along a certain stretch of highway, understand that there might be reasons beyond what they can officially explain. Trust the uniform. Trust the warning. Trust that some obstacles are protective rather than punitive. And never, ever follow the footprints that lead into the forest and suddenly stop, because where they stop is where the boundary begins, and beyond that boundary, the rules of our world no longer apply.